Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 96 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. It's no secret that we Americans have problems when it comes to race relations in the United States. Think about how many times, just in the last year even, that we've turned on our televisions, looked at our Twitter feeds, or browsed our favorite news websites and seen headlines that trumpeted another shooting or beating between white Americans and black Americans. Every time I see or read about one of these shootings or beatings, I wonder, how did we get here? How did the United States get to this point? As a historian, I naturally turn to the past for answers. Today's guest, Nicholas Guyatt, is a historian who has some answers for us. Like us, Nick is intrigued by the question of how the United States became a country divided by race. And he recently spent a lot of time thinking about and investigating the origins of American racial segregation, which is the basis of his book, Bind Us Apart: How Enlightened Americans Invented Racial Segregation. Given his expertise, Nick has agreed to help us think through and investigate the origins of American racial segregation too. So, during our conversation, Nick reveals the demographics of the United States after the War for Independence, the early American problem of racial integration, and how and why early American reformers invented the idea of racial segregation. Are you ready to explore this fascinating and timely topic? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is a university lecturer at Cambridge University. He has a keen interest in the history of colonial America, the United States, and the Atlantic world during the 18th and 19th centuries. He is the author of two books, Providence and the Invention of the United States, 1607 to 1876, and, most recently, Bind Us Apart: How Enlightened Americans Invented Racial Segregation. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Nicholas Guyatt.
Hey Liz, thanks so much for having me on.
In Bind Us Apart, Nick explores why and how the idea of separate but equal developed and how it came to lie at the heart of the United States. Nick, before we explore these fascinating questions with you, would you help us better understand the demographic landscape of the United States at the end of the War for Independence? What racial groups lived in the new United States, and where did these groups live?
It could be quite complicated, so maybe I'll try and simplify this a bit and just think about the major groups, if you like, which were white Americans, so those people who've been the British colonists who were then competing for their freedom, for their independence, and Native Americans and African Americans. And we have slightly better figures on white Americans and African Americans. Native Americans is a slightly trickier thing to try to guess, but if we talk about the area east of the Mississippi River, then white Americans during the American Revolution, we're looking at approximately 2.25 million or thereabouts. African Americans, you're looking at between 700 and 750,000, 90% of whom are slaves. So 10% roughly free blacks and 90% slaves. And then you also have Native Americans, and here it's much harder to predict. The estimates are much harder to come up with, but we're looking at, I think conservatively, at least 300,000 Native Americans living east of the Mississippi and a large number living to the west of the Mississippi as well. So if we just want to kind of crunch that and put it into number terms, we're talking about a white population of about 3/4, 75%. We're talking about a black population that's roughly 18, nearly 20%, and then 6 or 7% Native American.
And how did these people get along with each other? Did they live in the same towns? Did they coexist peacefully?
Again, it depends a lot on which regions of the United States you're talking about. And this is something really important to understand for the history of slavery. Most people will know from school that slavery is abolished in the United States in the North, way before it's abolished in the South. There's lots of abolition effort in the northern states, which is successful in a period between the American Revolution and 1804. But that's partly because many, many more African Americans are living in the South in slavery than in the North. So in northern areas, places like Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, you're looking at black populations of maybe 1 or 2% of the total, mostly urban. So in Massachusetts, we know this pretty precisely from the censuses that the federal government begins taking after 1790. So just to jump to 1800, in Massachusetts, you're talking about fewer than 2% of the total population is African American. Pennsylvania, it's around 3% in 1800. But then skip down into Virginia and South Carolina, and you're looking at a very, very different picture. So again, in 1800, you're looking at nearly 45% of the population is African American. So demographically, there's this massive difference between those southern states where slaves, where African Americans represent a really, really big chunk, nearly 50% of the population, and many of those northern states. So again, in the South, you're talking about slavery by and large as the dominant mode. So you're talking about white people living alongside African Americans there enslaving. In the northern states, you still have slavery. It clings on pretty strongly in many parts of the North, well into the 19th century. But in places like Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in Rhode Island, eventually in New Hampshire, you're looking at abolition. So you're seeing the black population mostly living in freedom, living near white people, and in some cases alongside white people. But from the very beginning of the Republic, there is, if you like, a kind of nervousness about blacks and whites living alongside each other, even in places like New England. So after slavery, you don't have this kind of idyllic model of integration between blacks and white people, partly because slavery has created a kind of prejudice in the minds of whites about living alongside blacks. With Native Americans, things look quite different because the majority of that 300,000 or so Native American population is living right on the edge or beyond white settlement. So we're looking at the western or northwestern parts of many of the existing states or into the territories that lie beyond the existing states, the places that are going to get mapped out in Thomas Jefferson's Northwest Ordinance in 1787. There's just one exception to that, which is in Georgia, in what's eventually going to become Alabama and South Carolina. So some of these established states in the southeast, you get populations of Cherokees and Creeks who are living kind of in the middle of those states. So there, the issue of how native people and white people are going to interact is very, very, very urgent. Those initial state governments really have to think about how they're going to relate to the Native American populations that live within their states.
The early United States sounds like a multiracial society, a society where people lived in a state of tension because other different groups of people lived nearby. This makes me wonder, when we read the Declaration of Independence today and its promise of all men being created equal, we read this promise as being inclusive of all Americans, regardless of their gender, race, or ethnic heritage. Did anyone believe that in 1776 or shortly thereafter, that all men were created equal and that citizenship applied to all men, regardless of their ethnic or racial origins?
Well, let me take that in two parts. The first question about the multiracial nature of the areas that will become the United States is so crucial to understand. It's crucial to understand for America's policy towards Native Americans, but it's especially crucial to understanding the American anti-slavery effort. Let me explain. When anti-slavery happens in France and in Britain, so we're talking here about people like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson or Jacques-Pierre Brissot de Vaurville in France. These are guys who are working in the 1780s especially. When those Europeans talk about ending slavery, they're discussing slavery that's happening mostly in the colonies, especially in the Caribbean and the West Indies. There are not significant black populations, so no more than a few hundred or low thousands in places like France and Britain. So when William Wilberforce talks about ending the slave trade or ending slavery, he is imagining a world after slavery where black people are living far away from the capitals, from the kind of central political societies of Britain. The same for France. In the case of the United States, what you have is African Americans living in every major city. You have slaves living in pretty much every major area before the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in 1782. You've got really enormous African American populations, up to 50% or close to it, in the southern states. What will happen after slavery? Well, you have an integration problem in the United States because unlike in the British or the French Empire, where slaves are somewhere else, there's the metropolitan area and then there's the colony, the periphery. In the United States, the colony has become the metropole. The center is the colony after independence. So with that in mind, if you're going to end slavery in the United States, you're going to have a situation in which your society is multiracial. The same with Native Americans. If you have 300,000 living east of the Mississippi, what will the relationship be between those people and the regular Americans, white American citizens? So the question of citizenship, of membership in this national community does look pretty different, I think, in North America than it does look for, say, Britain and France, which also have to manage the problem of slavery. And that brings us to your second question, which is about all men are created equal. Well, that phrase, when it was drafted and used by politicians like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, was not originally intended to refer to racial equality. The historian Peter Onuf is very good on this and says what Jefferson actually meant to say was that all legislatures are created equal. In other words, the colonial assemblies ought to be equal with the Parliament back in Westminster. But that phrase, all men are created equal, very quickly slips its bounds. And it's African Americans and later Native Americans who pick up that phrase and kind of throw it back at white politicians and say, you are committed to this premise that all men are created equal. If that obtains for white people, it should also obtain for African Americans and later for Native Americans. So as early as the 1770s, I mean after 1776, but before 1780, you begin to see court challenges to slavery in New England. You begin to see anti-slavery societies and agitators picking up those words and asking Jefferson or Adams or the other founding fathers to explain the inconsistency. How can there be slavery in a land dedicated to all men are created equal? And I think what's fascinating is that very often, more often than not, the founders don't have a good answer. It is very difficult in terms of science or religion to disagree with the premise that all men are created equal ought to apply to African Americans and Native Americans too. So this creates a kind of crisis when you combine it with that multiracial geography that I spoke about a moment ago.
Wow. Your juxtaposition of the United States with Great Britain and France really broadens our view, because many Britons and Frenchmen talked about how the new United States was not doing enough to abolish slavery, which very may well have been the case. But American society looked very different from British and French society. Great Britain and France didn't have the same social consequences for abolishing slavery that the United States did, especially when we stop and consider the consequences facing some southern states, where slaves really comprised a majority of the population. I mean, it's startling to consider the demographics of these three countries because they were just so different.
Well, that's precisely the point. And I mean, I kind of don't want to let early Americans off the hook here. I don't want to let the founding fathers off the hook. But at the same time, I want us to acknowledge the problem as it seemed to them. In a sense, in France or in Britain, you could be anti-slavery without being pro-integration. In the United States, if you were anti-slavery, you owned the problem of integration. So the consequences of emancipation you owned in the United States in a way that looked very, very different from in Britain and in France. So although I really dislike, the idea that historians would say America's not the same as other places, America's exceptional. Generally speaking, that idea of American exceptionalism is bad history. But I think that this is an instance where we really need to think about just how singular and distinctive the early United States was. Because if you were going to end slavery, especially in a land dedicated to all men are created equal, then you had an integration problem.
So how does putting the early United States in the Atlantic context affect how we view Americans' views on race? Could we talk about, how 18th century Americans thought about and defined race and how their views compared with European views?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another irony, Liz, which is that in a way, generally speaking, Americans, white Americans, American intellectuals, magazine editors, clergymen, in my book, I call them enlightened Americans, but, the kind of people that would have styled themselves as educated and quite liberal in their views, they are net importers of intellectual activity from Europe. So, I mean, Europe is interested in what's happening in America, but generally speaking, Europe still sets the pace. Europe still produces the big ideas, the big thinking about science, about culture, right the way through into the 19th century. And so here's an irony, right, which is that the Europeans don't have this same integration problem, at least not in terms of their core societies. We could talk a bit about how French empires or British empires overseas might work, but Britain and France themselves aren't facing the prospect that 40 or 30% of their population is going to be black anytime soon. So Europe and Britain are producing many of these ideas about race, and then they're being imported by people like Thomas Jefferson or by Adams or by the other intellectuals and politicians in the United States, where the social context of race looks totally different from Europe. So generally speaking, European ideas about race are surprisingly modern. Now, I don't want to overstate this because there are some very distinctive and murky things about some of these ideas of equality, but generally speaking, 18th century enlightened views on race emphasize just how malleable, how plastic all human beings are. So just to put it very simply, the notion would be that we're basically all born the same. And what makes us different is our environment. So the physical environment, what we eat, what the weather is like, but also our social environment. So the kind of groups that we hang out with, the kind of society that we have, that informs everything about us, our characteristics, mentally and politically, but even physically. So to put it in the crudest terms, the possibility that your facial shape might actually change across a generation or two if you were doing manual labor rather than skilled labor. This idea of human change totally depending on environment rather than on, if you like, innate racial characteristics. So there's no understanding here of race as genetic. It's all circumstantial and environmental.
We've been talking about Great Britain and France, but Kyle points out that we should also be talking about the Iberians and their American colonies. He'd like to know why the young United States came to think of race as a black-white binary. He notes that Spain and Portugal governed and structured their American colonies partly on race, but mostly on economic standing. He'd like to know why the former British American colonies preferred to structure and govern their societies mostly around the ideas of race when they had other models to look to.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, first of all, that it probably isn't quite right to say that race in the United States, the new United States, was just on a black-white binary. I mean, in fact, I think you could argue that there was a Native American black-white kind of scheme, even if, as I've tried to say in the book, in many ways, to some of these enlightened Americans I write about, so people like Thomas Jefferson or various intellectuals and politicians in the early republic, actually African Americans and Native Americans, they could be fitted into the same kind of frame. So it's a little bit more complicated than black-white. But there is a really big difference between the way in which social structures, the way in which colonization developed in Spanish America from the 15th century onwards, and the way in which it developed in British North America from 1607 onwards. And it's very simple. Generally speaking, in Spanish America and in Portuguese America, there was considerable mixing of the races during the early years. So there was considerable mixing during particularly the 16th century in places like Mexico and later on in Peru. And this is partly because the Spanish just couldn't persuade very large numbers of people to come from Spain to the colonies. So this status of mixed race members of the Spanish colonial society, the so-called mestizos, that was created very, very early. Generally speaking, in British North America, you didn't see anything like that. And it's funny because, I mean, you will know, and your listeners will know about the story of Pocahontas, right? I mean, we kind of glamorize, valorize, romanticize this relationship between Pocahontas and John Smith, although eventually it's John Rolfe that she ends up marrying in Virginia in the 1610s. That was an incredibly isolated example of intermarriage between white people and native people. And funnily enough, by the end of the 18th century, a lot of British historians and social scientists who are writing about colonization in America, they're kind of scratching their heads wondering why there wasn't more intermarriage between white people and Native Americans during the colonial British period in North America. But one of the practical repercussions of this is you don't have the same deep, extensive, mixed-race mestizo society in North America that you have in Mexico, Central America, and South America. So that's a crucial kind of reason why race can look a bit more like a binary in North America compared to this kind of tapestry rainbow of race and categories down in South America and in Central America.
Yeah, why was that? Why were British Americans less willing to intermarry with people from other races than Iberian Americans in Central and South America?
Well, I get into this in the book in a big way, partly because one of the potential solutions to this integration problem I've described is intermarriage, right? So I talk about this more in the context of the early 19th century than the colonial period. But if you think about it, I mean, one of the most obvious ways in which you would be able to braid together these peoples, Native American, African American, and white, in the early United States would be simply through having them marry each other. And one thing your listeners might be surprised to hear is that a surprisingly large number of quote-unquote enlightened Americans, of white theorists, white politicians, actually propose intermarriage between the races in the early United States. And I go into the book about the whole series of reasons why these intermarriage proposals eventually founder. And I could talk about that, but just maybe to answer your question about the colonial period, one reason, and this is a crude generalization, but I think it holds true, one reason that you just don't see the same levels of intermarriage during the colonial period is that, generally speaking, British settlers or settlers that arrived in the British colonies tended to come in families. So that idea of the family model of emigration tended to dominate. And the tensions that you see from a fairly early stage between Native Americans and these kind of family-based colonies very often lead to Native Americans being driven further to the west. So actually you don't have Native people working in as consistent and as kind of frequent a way within this economy of these new British colonies, North America, as you see it in the Spanish colonies, where Native American labor is absolutely central and where intermarriage is a lot more common.
As we know, the early United States was a slave society, and slavery complicated reformers' ideas about how they would integrate African Americans and former slaves into the new United States. Late 18th and early 19th century American reformers viewed the idea of degradation as the biggest hurdle they needed to overcome to integrate American society. Nick, would you tell us about degradation? What was it and who did it affect?
Yeah, this is a term which is very often bandied about. It's a very common term if you go back and you read newspaper articles or pamphlets and books about slavery. And sometimes historians have seen the word degradation or the word degraded as a kind of racism, right? Calling African Americans degraded demonstrates that you think they're inferior. Well, actually, it's a lot more interesting than that. The word degradation was applied to all kinds of things in 18th century Europe. So it was often applied, for example, to prisoners. So people whose crimes had degraded them. And by the end of the 18th century, there's a lot of discussion in Britain of how you can reverse this degradation of being a criminal, perhaps by sending people to Australia or finding penitentiaries in which you can reform them and kind of reverse these effects. And that word, degradation, is applied by a whole bunch of different white theorists in North America and the United States to the effects of slavery on African Americans. So just to track back to what I said earlier, if African Americans are, when they are born, absolutely equal in their potential to white people, if you immediately enslave them, so if you put them into the slave system, then there are so many different terrible aspects of slavery which damage their character. That's what these theorists say. So, for example, they are encouraged in slavery to work hard without any reward. Slavery encourages them to hate the people who are employing them. Slavery doesn't give them the ability actually to provide for themselves, to learn how to buy and sell for themselves, because it's this horrid, kind of crooked, crippling paternalism in which they're worked incredibly hard, but are not actually taught the same kinds of values that people have when they're in freedom. So these theorists claimed that the problem of ending slavery had two components. One was you needed to persuade the slaveholder to free the slave. So you had to say to a slaveholder, it's in everyone's interest if slavery is ended, you need to give up your slave. But that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is, according to these theorists, to reverse the effects of degradation. So in effect, to give African Americans the education, to give them the drive, to give them the motivation, to give them the skills that they need to survive in an equal society if they're going to become citizens. So in effect, that second part of the problem, I think, is just as worrying or just as difficult for many white Americans as the first part. How do you create a society based on equality in which some people have been denied access to all of the privileges, all of the perks and the kind of basics of citizenship for 25 or 30 years before they're free from slavery? How do you level things up? And so that's one of the problems that I really get into in the book, showing just how seriously these enlightened Americans took that challenge.
Did early American reformers ever view Native Americans as being degraded? Because in some cases, at least early on in the colonial period, some white colonists enslaved Native Americans.
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't get into the Native American slavery angle quite as much in the book. Well, for two reasons. One is that Native American captivity did look quite different in many cases from what we think of as the kind of classic example of chattel slavery for African Americans. But also the majority of Native Americans that I write about, so those in the Southeast, like the Cherokees and the Creeks, and then also those up in the old Northwest, as it was called, what's now the Midwest, so people like the Miamis and the Delawares and the Shawnees, they certainly haven't been subjected to those forms of slavery in anything like the same ways. So in terms of thinking about how they run in parallel with each other, white intellectuals and white politicians think that both African Americans and Native Americans have to climb over an obstacle before they could be considered members of the United States, outside of slavery, as equals or as citizens in the United States. For African Americans, the bar initially is this thing called degradation, which I've just described. For Native Americans, generally speaking, the bar is something called savagery. So the suggestion is that Native Americans Americans are equal in potential to whites, but their societies are more primitive. They're more backwards. They look more towards hunting. They haven't got the same kind of civilizational nous as white people. So the challenge is a parallel one. With African Americans, you need to try to find a way to end slavery and reverse what they call degradation. In relation to Native Americans, the challenge is to bring them up, to speed them through the stages of society and get them from quote-unquote savagery to a place where they can be, again, quote-unquote civilized. So if you like, there's a kind of anti-degradation policy, which many anti-slavery societies, anti-slavery writers and activists are working on in the early republic. But there's also a civilizing strategy, and that's actually adopted by the federal government. So, the slavery thing is more complicated because the federal government doesn't get as closely involved. That's mostly something out there in civil society, anti-slavery organizations and activists. But in relation to this civilizing project, this effort to try and bring Native Americans to a place where they could become citizens, that's actually a federal government project right away through the 1820s, something the federal government is deeply committed to, at least by its words. There are all kinds of problems with that civilizing policy, not least that Native Americans are a whole lot more proud of and fixed to their ways of life than white people imagine they will be, and aren't very happy about the idea they're being called uncivilized. But just one last thing on this, another terrible irony, the word degraded or the word degradation does eventually come to be applied to Native Americans. And it's a crazy story that it goes the way it does, because finally, during the War of 1812, which is a war that really has its roots in wars between Native Americans and white settlers up in what's now the Midwest, after that conflict, white theorists, Washington Irving is one of the first ones, a Sleepy Hollow guy, they begin to talk about Native Americans as degraded by their contact with the wrong kind of white settlers. So they're degraded by their contact with alcohol traders, these more kind of aggressive and violent settlers on the frontier. So actually we're told now that the problem is not that they are uncivilized, but that they have become degraded by the wrong kind of civilized settlers who are really just a different kind of savage, in relation to these white intellectuals, because they're peddling alcohol and guns and, squatting on Indian land. And so that degradation word after 1815 actually gets used by white intellectuals of both African Americans and Native Americans.
We clearly have an early American population, or at least a portion of it, that's thinking deeply about the kind of society that they'd like to set up in their new independent nation. And they're clearly considering how they could integrate Native Americans and African Americans into this white society. And I'd like to talk about the obstacles that these white Americans see as preventing Native Americans and African Americans from joining their society. Because I imagine that these white Americans are also thinking deeply about what they can do to help each group overcome these obstacles. So, since we're on the topic of Native Americans, would you tell us about the civilization program that the federal government was thinking about?
Yeah, maybe this is a good moment just to flag something up I said earlier, which is that when I talk about 18th century race thinking in Europe and eventually in the United States as having this kind of idea of equality, or having this idea that everybody has the same potential, I think it's really important to remember that in the minds of the theorists here, so I'm talking about French theorists like the Comte de Buffon, who's a very, very influential French thinker, or the American race theorist Samuel Stanhope Smith, the president of Princeton University, who wrote probably the most important book about race in the Atlantic world in 1788, an incredibly important and influential book. If you talk to those guys, their idea is that everyone has the potential to be the same, but it's not cultural relativism. So it's not like we'd say today, diversity enriches us and improves us. These guys are not kind of diversity merchants. What they think is that the very best people tend to be white and descended from Europeans. So when we talk about African Americans and Native Americans having equal potential with whites, they have equal potential to be white. So that's problematic, right? Let's just flag that up right away as something that is not quite egalitarian and has some really major problems attached to it. It is extremely chauvinistic, and obviously it has this kind of idea of white supremacy, if you like, embedded within it. But it's not quite the same as a sort of racism that says that people of color are permanently inferior to whites. It says people of color can become white. Well, again, that's a problematic assumption, but that governs a lot of this. And you can see that operating when you see how the first practitioners of U.S. Native American policy worked their plans for Native Americans after 1789. So the very first two secretaries secretaries of war in the United States were Henry Knox and Timothy Pickering. And they're very interesting guys. Henry Knox is a bookseller in Massachusetts, Pickering also from Massachusetts, but Knox is a bookseller, a general during the Revolutionary War, served as Secretary of War throughout the Confederation period, so just before the Constitution was passed. When he became the first Secretary of War of the new federal government in 1789, I'm paraphrasing here, but Knox writes to Washington and says, listen, we have the power to wipe out Native Americans. If we do it, we will solve our immediate problems. We won't have an issue in incorporating land to the West. But historians are going to hate us. In the future, people are going to look back on us in the same way that we now look back on the Spanish for what they did during the so-called Black Legend period, so raising the Caribbean and destroying native populations in Latin America. So Knox actually invokes this. He invokes the idea of the angry historian of the future who will condemn him and condemn Washington and condemn the founders. So Knox says we have to do it a different way. He says the idea that you can't civilize Native Americans is, and this is a quote, more convenient than just. So it would be great if we couldn't civilize them, we could just use that as an excuse to wipe them out. But we can't, because they can be civilized. So Knox's plan is pretty simple. He believes that Native Americans need to be given a nudge towards agriculture and towards becoming more like white Americans. And the way to do this, he thinks, is to go into Native American land, to persuade Native Americans to part with their land, which he thinks they don't really need, when they have a much smaller patch of land, rather than going off and endorsing hunting and kind of roaming around these larger areas, they will have to farm, they'll have to plant, they'll have to raise livestock, and then they will become more and more like white Americans. And in fact, Knox imagines that the frontier will become a series of adjoining settlements, white and native, and that those settlements will finally come together, and in effect, Native Americans will become white. So that's the vision, right? You go into native lands, offer them money, buy the land from them. They're now forced to work on smaller land. They become farmers. They intermarry with white settlers on the frontier. That's it. The end of Native Americans, but not through genocide, through turning them all into white people. That was the vision, and that went wrong for a whole bunch of reasons I'd be happy to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, we've been talking about white American ideas about how to integrate African Americans and Native Americans into white American society. As we've discussed, these ideas can be highly problematic when we look at them with our 21st century viewpoints. I wonder, though, what did Native Americans think about these reformers' plans to make them white?
Without wishing to generalize for 300,000 people, I would say that the vast majority, when they found out about these ideas, were not particularly happy about them. And again, it's really important here. I don't want to set this up in a way that suggests to your listeners, well, Native Americans needed to get with the program because, the United States was full of these white guys who were the future. They were technology, they were modernity, they were the 19th century. Why were Native Americans holding on to these kind of pre-industrial practices and ideas? If you actually wander off to the west, so let's say you parked yourself just to the north of the Ohio River, what's now Ohio or Indiana in the 1790s, and you went and you checked out some white settlements, I promise you would not be impressed. By which I mean those settlers are living a long way from the major white settlements. The access they have to markets to sell their goods is pretty poor. It's not very extensive. They are themselves, these white settlers, often very poor. If you think yourself into the mind of a native leader during that period, native societies are very well established. They are very tightly bound together. They've got a long and deep history, a long and deep culture. Generally speaking, the towns and the settlements that native people have established in that region north of the Ohio River are more considerable, much better established than these tiny pockets of white settlement. And absolutely crucially, when Native Americans see these white settlers, they think these guys actually look pretty ragged. I mean, you will remember 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. George Washington has to ride off and put down this western settler rebellion against the United States. One of the causes of that is that the federal government is trying to tax whiskey. Well, why are people in western Pennsylvania producing whiskey? It's because they can't get their grain. They can't get it to market without it spoiling, so it has to be turned into whiskey. So there are all kinds of problems that these white settlers on the fringe of the United States experienced during the 1790s. So when Native Americans look at these white settlers and think, I'm not sure we want to join the United States, they are not being like backwards peoples. They're saying, I have seen the future and it doesn't look great. So from their perspective, holding holding out against this offer of citizenship in the United States is really a pretty rational view. And it's one of the reasons why many of the founders are desperate to try to get Native Americans to come to places like Philadelphia. So, they say explicitly, people like Henry Knox and Pickering and Washington and Jefferson, let's get Native people out to New York or to Philadelphia so they can really see the future, because the future in the form of these white settlers in the West doesn't look so great. So that's one thing I'd say in terms of Native reluctance, to get with a civilizing program. But another one is that Native Americans are actually a whole lot more, quote unquote, civilized than many white theorists and politicians will acknowledge. And just to give one very basic example, there's a great deal of settled agriculture in the Native American societies of what's now the Midwest. So if you go and hang out with the Miami or with the Shawnee, you're going to find that these people have crops. They've been planting crops from before Columbus was, discovered Hispaniola. So for hundreds of years, they've had agriculture. So one of the problems with the white civilizing offer is it presupposes a kind of savagery or backwardness on the part of Native Americans, which isn't true. So again, Native Americans are kind of reluctant to give up their land, give up their culture, give up their societies to these, recent arrivals who in all sorts of ways don't seem so impressive.
Earlier, you mentioned that white early American theorists grappled with one big problem. How do they integrate a multiracial population into the new United States? And of course, that big problem had two smaller, but also big problems: Native American savagery and African American degradation. Now, it seems like slavery must have posed the biggest problem when it came to African American degradation. So, did reformers ever attempt to figure out how the United States might abolish slavery?
Yeah, absolutely. But in a sense, the plan to abolish slavery or plans to abolish slavery are always tethered to plans to reverse degradation. So I mentioned earlier that we need to think about the slavery problem from the perspective of these white reformers as having a double character, right? One is getting rid of it, which might mean that you have to try to persuade those whose economic interest is to keep slavery, that they need to abolish slavery. But crucially, the other part of it is you have to try and prepare for a society in which very large numbers of African Americans will now be living alongside white people in freedom. So in effect, what you see in all of these anti-slavery plans, which you see circulating from the upper South, so from places like Virginia, occasionally North Carolina, but Virginia, Maryland, through Pennsylvania, into New York, into New England, these anti-slavery plans that circulate in the 30 or 40 years after the Declaration of Independence, so right the way through until 1815, 1816, these plans pretty much have these two components. One is to try to figure out how you can persuade slaveholders to give up their slaves. The other is how can you provide for those slaves when they emerge from slavery? And I mean, one of the really interesting examples of this is New England lexicographer, the famous dictionary guy, Noah Webster. Most people, I guess, know him as the founder of this first great American dictionary. He's a big anti-slavery guy. And in the 1790s, he puts together a book promoting anti-slavery in which he says, well, listen, here's what we could do. We know that in Poland, they've been trying to get rid of serfdom. So we know they've been trying to abolish the institution of serfdom. And let's try and pick up a few lessons from that. And he talks about a particular Polish nobleman who has had a plan before he frees his serfs of giving them more time off, of giving them a chance to grow their own crops and find some kind of economic autonomy. And Webster says, let's do that. Let's go into the South and see if we can find slaveholders who have the same enlightened interest in ending slavery, and we'll give them this blueprint from Poland. And I found that a really interesting example because these serfs in Poland are not black, right? So in fact, what defines them is that they are forced laborers. So Webster imports an example for how you can end slavery that involves white people, not black people, Europeans, not Africans. And he's just one of many examples I go into in the book. The key problem with all this, and I guess this is the elephant in the room, is that many of these plans for trying to promote integration presuppose the involvement of the state. And I don't mean like New York or Massachusetts, I mean the government, right? I mean the national state. So in an era in which you have a massive social problem of slavery, or potentially a social problem in terms of how you integrate with Native Americans, how do you solve that problem when people's ideas about the state are pretty minimal? You know, Jefferson's old quote, which he may never have said, the best government's a government that governs least. You don't have an idea of a big state in American history really until the 1930s. It's really the New Deal, right? It's FDR that brings that to the fore. What if you had a social problem that needs a New Deal style government at the very beginning of the Republic? And I'm talking here particularly about making restitution to African Americans for slavery. How do you deliver on that? So part of the problem facing my enlightened Americans is they don't have an idea of what the state, what the government can do, which in any way fits the scale of the problem that faces them.
At the start of our conversation, you reminded us that the North abolished slavery long before the South. And let's not kid ourselves here. Some of the northern states took a very long time to abolish slavery. It's just that they made plans to do it early on. It seems like as these reformers grappled with how to deal with the problems of degradation and reversing its ill effects, that they had populations of former slaves in northern states that they could experiment with. So, did reformers conduct experiments with northern populations of former slaves? And if so, how did they attempt to reverse the ill effects of degradation?
One of the most interesting stories here is one I actually start the book with, which is the Virginia slaveholder, but also anti-slavery theorist. So this guy is someone I describe in the book as an anti-slavery slaveholder. One of these slaveholders who wants to end slavery and feels like he can do the first part of that, saying he's committed to ending slavery, but is struggling with the second part. What are we going to do with black people after they are freed? This guy was called St. George Tucker, and in 1795, he wrote from Virginia up to a friend of his in Massachusetts, a guy called Jeremy Belknap. And Belknap was a Congregationalist minister. He was also the founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society. He founded that in 1791. And Tucker wrote to Belknap and said, listen, could you tell me what's happened in Massachusetts since you abolished slavery? So I know that you guys have abolished slavery, now more than 10 years. What's going on with those free blacks? And what happens is that Belknap actually circulates these questions that he's been given by St. George Tucker about what kind of citizens black people have become to all kinds of people that he knows. So there's a kind of questionnaire that circulates throughout Massachusetts. And I won't summarize all of that because it's in a book, but what I think is so interesting is that the answers that Belknap gets back from his friends in Massachusetts, which he then sends to St. George Tucker in Virginia, sometimes you ask the same question and you get a completely different answer. So, for example, can black people vote? Well, some of Belknap's friends say yeah, and others say no. So actually the status of African Americans in Massachusetts is sufficiently murky that when these questionnaire responses come back, they don't necessarily all line up. And of course, the elephant in the room is that the Massachusetts black population is a little below 2%. So we're talking about a very, very, very small sliver of the population. The Virginia black population is close to 45%. So even though St. George Tucker of Virginia is doing this canvassing, this kind of sending out this questionnaire to find out what's going on in New England, in fact, the relevance of what's happened in New England to what might happen in a place like Virginia, which is the state with the most slaves in the Union from independence right away through to the Civil War. So Virginia always has more slaves than any other state. But the relevance of, a situation in which fewer than 2% of people are black to a situation in which 45% of the population is black is pretty questionable, right? Many historians have written about this, but I think they've often missed the fact that this challenge of integration looks so different in the Upper South that it really does grind the kind of gears of anti-slavery to a halt, because you don't just need to say that slavery is morally wrong. You need to say, how are we going to solve the integration problem? And in effect, New England doesn't provide a particularly good model, partly because, African Americans are still struggling in different ways after they've been freed in New England, but also because demographically, they're just a drop in the ocean. Even in places like New York and Pennsylvania, a drop in the ocean compared to the white population. They're not 40 or 45% as they are in the Upper South.
It's clear to us that early American reformers and government officials spent an awful lot of time thinking about how they would integrate African and Native Americans into the society of the new United States. But all this thinking led them to the conclusion that integration would not be possible. So they came up with the idea of colonization. Nick, would you tell us when reformers gave up on the idea of integration? And about what colonization was and when and why reformers adopted the idea?
Colonization is the idea that you will end slavery by relocating former slaves to somewhere else from where they were enslaved. And the first practical manifestation of this happened in Sierra Leone in Western Africa in 1787, which itself is an interesting story with some American connections, because although that effort was to relocate hundreds of black British people, in fact, they were originally African Americans, so they were actually not black Britons originally. They were African Americans who had fought for Britain during the Revolutionary War. They were on the losing side, so they fought against the Patriots. They were on the losing side. They were evacuated by the British to London. Another group was evacuated to Nova Scotia, so to what's now Canada, after the war, in 1782 and 1783. And then a bunch of philanthropists in London, led by a very important anti-slavery theorist called Granville Sharp, established this colony on the western coast of Africa in 1787 called Sierra Leone. That was the first practical example of colonization. But again, the context is very different. So there were around perhaps 5,000 black people in London in the 1780s. So again, we're talking about population here well, I forget off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it's close to 1 million. It's an enormous population in London. So these are a relatively small, tiny amount of black people proportionally in London. But the reason why colonization was proposed for the British was Britain hoped that if they had something like Sierra Leone, in which black people could work as free people rather than slaves, raising tropical crops, sugar or cotton or other goods, but they could do that as free laborers, that it would be a way to roll back the slave trade. So you could make the case, right, now we have a viable economic model of free black labor, and we can use this to roll back the slave trade. So this British example of Sierra Leone in 1787 was not principally a segregationist initiative. Come to the American side, and colonization is being talked about from the 1770s. Thomas Jefferson is one of the very first people to talk about it in the 1770s in Virginia. It plays a really important role for Jefferson in his notes on the state of Virginia. So his anti-slavery plan for Virginia is based on the idea of moving slaves out of the United States to the Caribbean or Africa or somewhere else. So that's in 1785, so that's when it's published. So he's writing this in the early 1780s. So that's Jefferson's idea. And then you see this throughout. So from the 1780s right the way through until 1816, when there's actually a society founded in Washington called the American Colonization Society, which is dedicated to the idea that you will relocate the black population in the United States to a colony somewhere else. And that colony ends up being Liberia, which is founded in 1820-21, and it's right next to Sierra Leone. So that's the idea that you can send black people after slavery somewhere else is always a temptation for these theorists and reformers, these enlightened Americans who are struggling with the challenge of integration. It's that button that's just on the other side of the desk that they can nearly push at any point. And actually, they begin pushing it as early as the 1770s and push it pretty constantly and consistently after 1815.
You just mentioned a place called Liberia. Does this mean that these early American reformers actually attempted to implement their ideas about colonization and formed colonies?
Yeah, so Liberia is the best example. They begin to try to found Liberia in 1819. The actual colony, as we now know it, the nation of Liberia, is founded in 1821. But it's a fascinating story of how it gets founded, because I mentioned the American Colonization Society was created in 1816. This was a coalition of northern anti-slavery reformers and southerners, particularly upper southerners. And historians have sometimes argued about this and claimed that the fact that southerners were involved in this proves that really it was not an effort to end slavery, but just an effort to deport blacks. And there is a bit of evidence for that in the sense that the Colonization Society, when it was founded in 1816, had the approval of James Madison, James Monroe, all of the kind of cream of Washington's political class were members of this society. The one thing you can point to say that there is something particularly fishy about its anti-slavery credentials is that initially it claims its job is to remove free people of color. But of course, that doesn't just mean free blacks in the North. It also means free people in the South who've been liberated by their slaveholders, by the people that are masters. They've been liberated because they're going to be sent to Africa. So actually, I think that generally speaking, one of the ways you can tell that this is supposed to be an anti-slavery organization is it never really takes on in the Deep South. So places like Georgia and South Carolina, the Colonization Society never gets a foothold. And in fact, those states begin to move against it because they see it as a danger to slavery. So the Colonization Society is founded in 1816. The Congress passes in 1819 what's called the Slave Trade Act, which creates a little opening for President Monroe to use the U.S. Navy to create a colony or help create a colony in West Africa for slaves to be returned to. And these are slaves that have been illegally traded. So after 1807, the slave trade in the Atlantic is banned in the United States from January the 1st, 1808. And so this new Slave Trade Act in 1819 says, well, listen, where are we going to take any slaves that have been illegally enslaved and we find them on a ship somewhere in the Atlantic? Where will we take them? Let's take them to Liberia. But of course, Liberia also becomes the potential destination for any slaveholders in the United States who want to free their slaves but don't want to live alongside them. The only problem in terms of thinking about this as an emancipationist strategy is that black people don't want to go because, African Americans don't want to leave the United States. They don't want the country of their birth, which they've spent a huge amount of time and effort building, in effect, to be the land from which they're exiled, particularly not to Liberia, which gets a reputation very quickly as being a very unhealthy place. The colony is run by white guys right the way through the 1840s. So Liberia is not an attractive destination. But that problem of black consent is absolutely pivotal because this is not a deportationist scheme. So what we don't have here is white people saying we're going to end slavery by expelling blacks. Black people are supposed to want to go. And the fact that African Americans refuse to read the script is, I think, the main reason you don't see very large numbers of black people being removed from the United States in the early US.
It's really interesting because now that we know the history of how these ideas about race and integration and now colonization developed, it's really not that hard to see how a man like Andrew Jackson, who came of age in the early days of the early republic, decided that perhaps the United States should colonize Native Americans too. Would you tell us about the Indian Removal Act of 1830?
It's a great mistaken assumption, I think, of American history that many, many, many people have made, that in effect Andrew Jackson came up with the idea of removal. And I go into this at great length in the book, and I think it's such a fascinating story because the idea of removal, and we know the horrible outcome of that, the Trail of Tears in 1838 and 39, which saw those Cherokees forcibly marched across the Mississippi, 800 miles, thousands killed during the march. The origins of that story don't lie in Andrew Jackson's racism. They lie in this liberal, benevolent, enlightened thinking about colonization, because the guys who actually promoted the notion of a Western Indian home were not Jacksonian Democrats. They weren't these white racists. They were missionaries and government officials who had been working on the problem of how to, quote unquote, protect Native Americans since 1815, 1814, the end of the War of 1812. And there's one in particular, a Baptist missionary called Isaac McCoy, who saw the effects of white settlement in what's now the Midwest. So he worked in Michigan and Indiana and just saw these streams of white people rushing into these ancestral Indian lands during this War of 1812 kind of moment and just afterwards. And he said, look, if we could just take Native Americans west of the Mississippi, if we could put them in an area where we could protect them from white people, then in effect they'd have the chance to become civilized. So what you see is a complete 180 from that original assumption that white settlers would be the instruments of civilizing Indians. McCoy, after the War of 1812, says, well, actually, white settlers are the obstacle to civilizing Indians. So if we can just take Native Americans to a place where they don't have contact with white settlers, just some benevolent government officials and missionaries, then we can get them, quote unquote, civilized. And then when white settlers finally catch up, when they finally get that far west, then it's going to be fine, because at that point, Native people will be just like white people. So it's actually this liberal, benevolent, but kind of horribly flawed vision of Isaac McCoy, which becomes the liberal battering ram that gets these ideas into the mainstream, because this policy of Indian removal, or colonization as it was known, is adopted by the Monroe administration in 1824 and by John Quincy Adams's administration in 1826. So what Jackson does is he tears off the liberal kind of curtain, because you remember I said a moment ago, the really crucial part of these schemes for colonization is that people of color have to consent to them. And black colonization really struggles because people of color won't go. Well, Jackson is the guy that forces Native Americans to leave. Well, Van Buren, actually his successor, sends the U.S. Army down to Georgia to expel these Native Americans forcibly. Now, when you do that, any suggestion that this is benevolent or liberal flies out the window. So Jackson's tactics turn colonization into expulsion or removal, but the logic of separating peoples of color from white people is deeply liberal. And I think that's the really creepy, disturbing, and unnerving thing that I hope the book will open people's eyes to.
We started our conversation today by talking about how you use your book, Bind Us Apart, to explore how and why the idea of separate but equal developed and how it came to lie at the heart of the United States. Is the short answer to those questions colonization?
Yeah, in a sense, I think that's the answer. Let me put it this way. We think about freedom as being like a kind of seed in American history, right? So it's planted in 1776 with all men are created equal. And then it gets watered by, the abolitionists, and they bring abolition to the North. And then in the Civil War, there's water and fertilizer in much greater quantities. The tree gets bigger, you end slavery. The Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, again, bigger and bigger and bigger. The tree becomes larger and larger and covers more and more people. It's a kind of linear view of freedom and of racial equality. And I don't mean at all to disparage the contribution that was made, particularly by the abolitionists that grew up after 1830. So the immediate abolitionists, people like William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass. I mean, the incredible work that those guys did to move this kind of ball of freedom down the field. But I would say this, that I don't think that you can tell this story in this linear way, because from the very beginning of the United States, you have large numbers of white people. You could say that they're moderately anti-slavery rather than radically anti-slavery, who believe that slavery is wrong, but have an incredibly hard time imagining living alongside people of color. So in a sense, these are people that disclaim or would absolutely, deny that they were racists in the modern sense or the 18th century sense, but they would be reluctant to live alongside people of color. So in a sense, what I think I'm trying to do in the book is give you a sense of the deep history of the I'm not a racist, but community in the United States, which I'm afraid extends to a lot of people that see themselves as liberal. I think I also want to try to explore the fact that the racial geography of the United States has always had this skewedness, right? So the job of integration, the mission of actually creating integrated societies has always looked inconsistent geographically, because in places like New England and New York and Pennsylvania, the job of integration looks so different from in the South. So we tend to locate white racism or the kind of sources of white conservatism on race in the South. We think about Jim Crow and we think about segregation, after 1877. But actually, a really key thing to remember is that the South bore the greatest brunt of, if you like, the integration burden. And you can argue, well, look, the Southerners benefited as much as they did from cotton and from, the huge profits, the terrible brutality of slavery. But I'm trying to recover this earlier moment in which whites and blacks struggled more or less equally to see if they could become part of this anti-slavery integrationist community. And Northern whites had many of the same problems that Southern whites experienced when it came to actually doing the difficult work of integrating peoples of color. So that integration story, I think we need to recover and place alongside the anti-slavery story or include in the anti-slavery story, because in many respects, this, I'm not a racist, but problem in American history, it doesn't look that dissimilar in the founding moment to the way that it looks more recently.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Nick, many of the reformers in your book wrote about creating separate states for blacks and Indians somewhere in North America, and in some cases, they even wrote about making these states part of the Union. In your opinion, what might have happened if one or more of these states had come into being during the early Republic?
There are efforts from 1778 in the case of Native Americans right the way through until 1865 in the case of African Americans, where you have very prominent government officials, elected white officials, suggesting that the way to solve the problem of race is through separation. I mean, actually, the Republican candidate for governor in Ohio in 1865, a guy called Jacob Cox, proposes that Florida be turned into an exclusively black state, which is very similar to the proposal that was made by that guy I mentioned earlier, the Virginia slaveholder St. George Tucker. He said something very similar in 1796. So the notion that you could relocate black people or native people to a political community that would be entirely self-governing and part of the Union is just fascinating. I mean, I think that had it happened in the case of Native Americans, the difficulties of finding unity among Native American nations would probably have capsized the project. So Native Americans, were reluctant to see themselves as, part of the same community because their history, was based on distinct nations. So they all had their own sovereignty, their own culture. So the idea of kind of cramming them into a state in which what united them was being native people, we would have struggled to get far with that. I think the question for African Americans is a lot more interesting, problematic, but interesting, because of course black nationalism or forms of black political separatism, you can see that running right the way through the early Republic period. So you find a number of people like Martin Delany who are strong advocates at different moments of creating a separate black community somewhere or other. You can see it in people like Marcus Garvey. You can even see it running up through the 1970s as some of the radical groups suggesting that, it might be a good idea to have separate black states in the South, particularly places in the South where there is either a black majority or African Americans at nearly 50% of the population. So places like Mississippi in particular. So I think that this notion of a distinct black political nation is a lot stronger perhaps than the one of a distinct native nation. But it's pretty clear, I think, that African Americans or Native Americans would have found it very hard indeed to accept this as the gift of white people. So to accept this as a form of racial management for which they were supposed to be grateful to whites. So I don't know how it might have changed American history, but I think things would look very different.
Nick, it's clear to us that you like to tackle big questions and topics. So now that you've grappled with the origins of racial segregation, what's next for you?
Sometimes as a historian, when you finish a project, what you want to do is write kind of the same book again, or you want to write a book on pretty much the same topic and kind of carry on having the arguments you've just had in a slightly different frame. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because in a way, as historians, when you finish a book, maybe people will read it, but unless you're there to kind of keep picking it up and waving it at people, it's a lot easier not to read books than to read books, right? So in the sense, I kind of understand why very often in our business, we will kind of stay within the same area. So I have some ideas for what I might do if I decided I wanted to write something very like this book. But I'm going to tell you about something different very briefly, which is I'm really interested and have been very interested in empire. I'm particularly interested in how the United States came to believe that empire was a dirty word, which remained true for pretty much the whole of the 19th century. So when Britain and France in particular were establishing and expanding their empires overseas, the United States generally didn't do empire, by which I mean it didn't take overseas colonies. Liberia is a really good example, right? I mentioned it was founded in 1821. When there's a big debate about Liberian independence in 1847, the United States Congress debates the possibility of turning Liberia into an official American colony, and it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen partly because legislators say we don't do empire. So I'm very interested in how empire, when it seemed as if it was becoming the norm in other parts of the world, in Europe, right, seemed as if in the United States it was something that Americans just didn't do. So that would be a very different book, but maybe that's the one I ought to write.
And where can we find more information about you? And how we can contact you if we still have more questions about the origins of Separate But Equal?
Well, you can write to my email address, which is nsmg100@cam.ac.uk. I said that very fast, but if you just Google my name, Nicholas Guyatt, you will find my website, Cambridge. Or you can follow me on Twitter, which is @NicholasGuyatt, all one word, where I tend to tweet a lot about American history and politics and just occasionally about Pokemon.
Nicholas Guyatt, thank you for helping us explore the origins of racial segregation in the United States and for sharing details from your book, Bind Us Apart.
My pleasure, Liz. Thanks so much for having me on.
It's clear that the United States has had a race problem from its earliest days. As our exploration with Nick just revealed, the problem of race consumed the waking hours of many early American reformers. They recognized that the early United States was a slave society, and that slavery created a large gap in the lived experiences between whites and black slaves. So, free white men could benefit from an education and from owning their own bodies and their own labor. And as members of a free society, they also had opportunities to think about ways they could make society better. But enslaved people did not generally benefit from an education. They didn't own their own bodies, and they certainly didn't own their own labor. Nor did slaves have the same opportunities to think about society. So, early American reformers really worried about this gap in lived experiences. They worried that former slaves would become a burden on society and that they'd be unable to care for themselves and contribute to the common good. Now, early American reformers thought similar ideas about Native Americans, too. And all of these thoughts made them wonder, how do we integrate peoples with such different lived experiences into our American society? Over time, white reformers experimented with ways to integrate African and Native Americans into the new United States, which, for these reformers, meant implementing programs to make African and Native Americans white. And when African and Native Americans proved resistant to conforming to white society and becoming culturally white, reformers determined that integration would not be possible, that whites, blacks, and Native Americans could not live peaceably side by side. So reformers came up with the idea of colonization, the idea that the only way whites, blacks, and Native Americans could live peaceably together was if they lived in separate societies. Today, the United States is still grappling with the problems that come from the separate but equal idea. How will we overcome the problems of our multiracial society? I don't know exactly. But the United States' history shows us that separate but equal is not equal, and that trying to deny that we live in a multiracial society doesn't work. If you'd like more information about Nick, his book Bind Us Apart, or a list of previous episodes that complement this episode, you should check out the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/096. If you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends, family, and everyone you know about it. The best way for podcasts to find new listeners is by word of mouth support, and recommending Ben Franklin's World is the highest compliment you can give it. What other lessons from history do you think might help the United States solve its race problem? Send your ideas to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode, or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.